Welcome to this UX of online learning talk. This is what I'm going to talk about today, the UX and Learning 101. Just kind of start off with the way I'm thinking about UX and online learning, the 3 types of online courses in 2021, and how to make learning stick. So I know that there are a few people out there who might even do UX design for education companies, so this will be super interesting to you. But I'm really going to talk about this just for anybody that learns online, and especially designers that learn online. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to try to squeeze all the past 5 years of experience into this 30-minute talk. So let's go. You're going to see a little bit of light on my face because in Berlin the sun never sets right now, so that will change periodically. But to get going, I wanted to ask something of everyone. So I'm really curious, what's the best learning experience you've ever had? This means online, offline. What's the best learning experience you ever had? Put that in the chat, please. I'd like to see, I'm a UX designer, so getting feedback is always really important to me. Pulling a little bit of data before we start this talk off. So yeah, if you could put in the chat what your best learning experience is that you've ever had. Online, on my own. Okay, online, offline. Can you tell me a little bit about these learning experiences? What school was it? What was the course? What sort of things were you learning? Half direct instruction, half collaboration with classmates during the class time. Okay, learning Premiere Pro with Skillshare. Skillshare is a super popular one. Hands-on interactive in-person training. Okay, thanks, Chang. Human-computer interaction. So maybe that's a master's degree. On-the-job, apprentice style. Yeah, Alicia Kwan. Alicia has a really great podcast, the UX of EdTech. You should check it out. Appreciate these responses. Career Foundry. I know there are probably quite a few Career Foundry people in the audience. Okay, yeah, that's interesting to hear. And just for me, what I'm listening for is, what do you think a learning experience is? When we're doing UX research, it's always good to ask a question that gets a more deeper response. And what I think is also interesting is, what I didn't see in there was anyone talking about some content. They weren't talking about some things that they learned, like they weren't saying, oh, this text that I read, this book that I read, things like that. Because I asked you about a learning experience. But the way that I think about this, and this is like a bad textbook and a good teacher can still be a really good learning experience. But a bad textbook and a bad teacher can be a really bad learning experience. So we're gonna dive into that a little bit. And seeing some of these answers and maybe what's going on with that and what learning experiences are offline and especially online. So hang on to this little idea, and we're going to dive into talking about this. So just to give you a little refresher to catch you up on, if you've never done UX design, you can get a little bit of that here, but also just learning 101, the psychology behind learning. A lot of this will touch on some instructional design, but see, my lens is going to be UX design. I wasn't classically trained as an instructional designer. I didn't go to school for that. I worked as a UX designer at an online education company, and I worked with a lot of really smart education people there. Some instructional designers, people that got masters in this, people that have been doing this for a long time for different programs. So I learned a lot from them. So I just wanted to make that clear up front, that a lot of this comes from learning from other really smart people in the space and trying things out at an online education company. But as I think you're going to see, there are definitely some parallels between being a UX designer and designing a good learning experience. So as a UX designer, our field kind of started off in human-computer interaction. And I know someone put that in the chat, HCI. HCI is the abbreviation for human-computer interaction. And this is kind of where the field first started to become official. This is where, there was degrees called this at universities. For the first time. And this was all about just the interaction between the human and the computer. And notice that word interaction. Actually, after human-computer interaction kind of became a sort of field, we had things called interaction designers. So people were calling themselves an interaction designer. In fact, in my first job, there was a lot of people still calling themselves interaction designer, and a lot of people still do. I think it's a really interesting way to talk about what we do in UX, interaction design, UX design. They're pretty similar. You might have people that argue on that, but I feel like kind of interaction design kind of evolved into UX design in a lot of ways. But what's going on there with UX design? Like, what's happening? I think the easiest way for me to describe UX design to anyone who doesn't know it, this is always a fun challenge. You should try it yourself if you're a UX designer. I think of it as like there's a big gap between the user and the technology. And back in the 90s, there was a huge gap. A lot of the tools that they were building into software on computers, they weren't really thinking about the user. They were really just thinking about what functions, what features are we going to have. What they really wanted to do was, get the thing out there. It was all very new, but the problem was not many users could use this tech. You had like maybe even to know a little bit of code to know how to work some of these computers in the early days. So there was a huge gap there. And the way that they filled this gap normally was with manuals. You had to be kind of taught how to learn interfaces and the computer programs. And human-computer interactions were pretty minimal, and they definitely weren't as nice as they are today. And if you're a UX designer, if you've learned anything about UX design, then you can pretty much time it. It's only been 6 minutes in this talk, and I'm already bringing up Don Norman. But Don Norman is really kind of influential in the thought leadership around UX design. And his book, Design of Everyday Things, talked about this mindset. If technology isn't intuitive for the user, it's not designed well. And in the 90s and early 2000s, that was a pretty radical idea. When computers first came out, the idea was that, well, humans should learn to use the computer. It shouldn't be that the computers are just easy to use. Like, they're tools. You have to learn how to use them. That was kind of the mindset. But Don Norman took a lot of learnings from product design, kind of ergonomics. So he kind of pioneered this like ergonomics of software, saying that you should adapt the technology and the software to the user, because the human is the most important aspect of this. And this kind of gave rise to a whole new field. Before, you were just having very technical engineering focused people. And suddenly, when you're designing software applications, designers could come along and do a lot. And of course, businesses finally caught on that they'll sell a lot better if they're easier to use. And that really started to change things. So through UX design, we were able to bridge this gap between user and technology. And so they're getting a little bit closer to each other. They're a little more intuitive to use. That's what I feel like UX design started. And I still feel like there's a lot of that in the way we do UX design today. But when I talk about learning and I think about learning, I still think of it like this gap. So instead of a gap between user and technology, really the gap is between the current you, the learner, and the future you, the awesome future learner. And bridging that gap is a lot of like a good metaphor to think about when you're thinking about what learning is. So what's in that gap is also quite interesting. There could be a lot of different types of gaps. So this could be a knowledge gap. Maybe you just need some information, like maybe you need to know how to export in Figma. Once you know how to do that, you've got it. You don't need to have practice to do that. You're good. That's a knowledge gap. Skills gap, if you need practice to be able to do it or get good at it, that's going to be a skills gap. Motivation and habits gap, very, very similar. Motivation is like you need to be a motivated learner to have a good learning experience. So there's oftentimes a gap where are you motivated or not? Habits, maybe you know how to do the right thing, but you're not doing it. That's a big one. The environment, what's going on around you. Maybe you're not living in a country that allows for so much learning. Maybe you have 2 jobs, you don't have enough time for it. There can be a gap to being, how you are today in the future. Sometimes the environment can be a big factor. And then communication. Sometimes the gap between learning is you just don't know, like you haven't been told the right thing to do. I think skills gap is going to be probably the one you're most familiar with. If you're learning design skills, designers talk about the things they need to go from like junior to senior. They talk about the gap being skills, hard skills when you start off your career, more soft skills as you get more senior. So that's how you can think about the different gaps that might be involved in learning. And learning itself is a bridge. It bridges the gap between your current self and your future self. And this is how I think about learning, but this concept doesn't actually come from me. It's from one of my favorite instructional designers, Julie Dirksen. She's got a great book, Design for How People Learn. And I really love this metaphor for describing learning. And she's been doing instructional design for like 15 years. And when I saw this, I thought, yes, this is very similar to the way that I'm thinking about UX design. And what's similar about it that I really think is interesting is that this is not just a one-off bridge. Learning is a journey. There are multiple gaps and multiple bridges that you're building. And talking about learning as a journey, for me, is the seal for like, okay, this is getting a parallel to UX design. Because with UX design, you often think about the path your customer takes through a product with a journey map. And, like the way people use products is more like a movie than a snapshot. It's step by step. So thinking about learning and zooming out like this and seeing it as a journey, this can really help you understand for yourself how to learn better. And if you're designing, you're a UX designer working on a platform that's doing education, you can use this as well. But this learning as a journey, I think, is actually something that you should be doing your whole life. And I'll get to that at the very end. So learning is a journey, right? But what does it take to cross that bridge? If learning is the bridge between yourself now and your future self, what does it take to cross it? Well, buying a course is not going to help you cross that gap. Buying it alone isn't doing anything about it. So you buy a Coursera course, maybe you got a little bit of education budget, maybe you got like, a few €100, a few $100, and you want to buy a course. Well, just purchasing alone isn't enough. But I'm curious, I've got a poll here. I'm curious if you've ever purchased an online course and never finished it. This is a behavior that I've noticed a lot in designers. We tend to want to collect certifications, even though UX design is not classically something that you certify, not like lawyer or something like that. But certifications is something we sometimes try and go for. But have you ever started an online? You ever purchased an online course, started it, and then couldn't get through to it and couldn't finish it? If you go to the poll tab, it's on the right side. You can click that tab and you can vote over there. I'm curious if you've ever done this behavior. We'll check back in on that later, because I'm really curious to see if this is an extremely common behavior, or if you're brave enough to admit that you bought a course and didn't finish it. But this is something that I've noticed in a lot of people. And looking at what makes that happen, why you don't finish a course, is super interesting to me. And I think it'll shed some light as I talk about this, just shed some light on why that happens. So the 3 types of online courses. This is how I'm thinking about when I look at online courses. After working in the industry for 5 years, when I see things like an online course and I run into it randomly, I can kind of start to figure out which category it falls into. So I want to talk about those 3 categories. Looks like we got some poll results. 80% of you, around 80%, said yes, you've purchased a course and never finished it. Around 21% said no. So that's pretty interesting. Definitely the majority have purchased and not finished. So what's going on with that? I think knowing the 3 types of online courses in 2021, as we get into this, it'll become a little bit more clear. One of the biggest factors, I think, in whether a course is successful from your part or not is what kind of interactions happen on it. Now, when you first get into taking an online course, if you look at product pages and marketing, you might think, oh, content is the main thing I need to be looking at here. But actually, content and information is not the building block of education. Interaction is the building block of education. So looking at the interactions between one-way and two-way types of education, this is kind of how I separate and categorize the different types of online education that I see. So on one side, on the extreme, you have just a one-way communication. You've got a lecturer, much like myself at the moment, and there's an audience, and you can't say anything back to me. In this platform, you can send me emojis, you can ask questions, I can actually see the chat. So I'm seeing that, Katerina and Cinta were saying things recently, and it's kind of a live interaction, but it's not the same as on the polar opposite end, two-way, where you've got a facilitator going back and forth between participants, and the participants can talk back to the facilitator, and they can also kind of lead the class a little bit. This is what I would call two-way, because the facilitator can see you, you can raise your hand, you can ask a question, and then you can come back. So when you ask a question at the very end, you're getting a little bit of that two-way interaction. So I'm really trying to focus on the interactions here, because I think that's really key to success when you're doing an online course. So hang on to that for a second. One-way versus two-way. And I want to talk about the first type. So the Masterclass model. I'm going to talk about this because this is probably the first thing you ran into when you saw about online courses. And these have been around since around 2012, so over 10 years. And when they first came out, people thought it was going to change the world entirely. And they had a really good mission behind them. They were really talking about how they're going to make education accessible all around the world. Accessibility was something they talked quite a bit about. The way these work is they're self-paced. So you record some content, you write some text, whatever it is as a school, you put it online, and then you sell the course and people can go through the content. Sometimes there's like assignments, and then you complete those assignments and then it generates a certificate for you. So a lot of times these are kind of like called certificate programs, but Masterclass is a really popular brand that's a lot like this. So that's why I'm calling it the Masterclass, but people in EdTech, people in the education world will call it a MOOC, Massive Open Online Course. It started when schools started putting on free courses. They would take, Harvard would put on a popular course they had and have it online for free. Pretty radical idea at the time. And the fact that you could access that information, people were like, wow, I can access this Ivy League school's course. And the people thought this was really going to change education. Actually, the founder of Udacity said that in 10 years, he said this in 2012, in 10 years, that there would only be 10 big players in higher education. And he was hinting that they would be MOOCs. As you can tell, that did not happen. It's 2021, but Masterclass models, the MOOCs, they're still in the rise. And here you're going to see a couple of the big players, Coursera being the biggest one, Interaction Design, edX, Udemy, The Future, which is a design one, and IDOU, which was on the line with the next model. But taking a look at an example, so this is from the future. Like, I think it's always interesting to look at the marketing for these websites, because now that I've worked at an education company, I understand the ways that they talk about the product, but I know the UX behind that product. So take a look at this for a little bit. So what they're saying here is there's homework assignments, there's role-playing exercises, there's pre-recorded Q&A, bonus material, and lifetime updates. And then this method, Master the Socratic Six. If you look closely at those things, there isn't going to be any interaction with anyone. So that makes me put it on the one-way side, which is on the Masterclass model. So this is going to be a lot more one-way. Chris Do is a very busy designer. He makes really good videos, but he doesn't have time to have people raise hands and join a live class and things like that. So a lot of times people in that model will go like, oh, I can just record really good videos, put it online, and I can like make money while I sleep. That's kind of the idea behind the Masterclass model. And a lot of these courses are actually called Masterclasses. So yeah, if you look at these things, role-playing exercises, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to do that in a class. It just means you have an exercise to do. Sometimes like they'll say homework assignments, but it's like, here's your text. This is the homework assignment you need to do. So when you're looking at these things, if you really want accessible you want to really access this type of content, if you're interested in learning on your own, and you prefer to kind of watch and have it be broadcasted to, this is the kind of thing you're going to get in the Masterclass model. Now looking at Interaction Design Foundation, I think this one's extremely interesting because I know a lot of designers take Interaction Design Foundation courses. And I'd definitely be interested in your experience with that. You can definitely put that in the chat. Tell us whether you enjoyed it, what you liked about it, which course you took. I think that's always interesting to know because they have some really interesting content. But as you see, a lot of it is very content focused. So self-paced online course with no deadlines. Self-paced is what they will talk about with the Masterclass model because you get access to it. Sometimes you pay for that, and if you stop paying, they remove the access. But essentially, as long as you're paying, you get access to this content. And it's self-paced, so you can do it whenever you want. There's no deadline, so you can work on it at 2 a.m. in the morning. That's the sell. The downside to that is that no one's motivating you, no one's pushing you to work on it. So these can be pretty difficult to get through. Moving on to the hybrid model. Looking at the hybrid model, it's kind of hard to come up with a name with this, but mostly these are online boot camps. This is the industry that I worked in before. The biggest player there is going to be General Assembly. You've probably heard of them. Not all their courses are going to be in the hybrid model, but they kind of did this online boot camp before anybody else. Career Foundry, Springboard, and Thinkful are also big players in the design boot camp. There's tons and tons of coding boot camps, but I put up the ones that were design specific. These are offering flexibility, whereas the Masterclass model offered accessibility. They're both flexible, but you see that this hybrid model will sell flexibility a bit more. And these are going to be session-based. And what that means is you purchase a session. You purchase a year's worth of time to complete these courses. And as you go through, you have an expiration date. A lot of times you're going to have a mentor, some sort of interaction there. There's going to be a lot more interactions with someone who's done this before. A lot of times the masterclass models, they're more just having other peer interactions, so people who are also in your class. And the hybrid model also has interactions with the class sometimes, usually through like a Slack group or something like that. So that's the hybrid model. It's really interesting if you look at the product pages here, like it'll say, this takes full-time 5 months, part-time 6 months. But what they're doing is selling you a different session size. They're selling you a session that goes for 3 months sometimes. They're selling you sessions for 6 months. It's the same work, and you have to do twice as much work in 3 months as 6 months because it's like the expiration date, sort of a timer. Sometimes there will be live online lectures, and then that pushes it more to the next category. But sometimes they will sort of pretend like it's a live online lecture, but that's not this category. Generally speaking, this one's going to be like asynchronous, meaning you work on it whenever you want, you submit something, you get feedback whenever you want, and you can check it, work on your own time. This is good for people who have a job and don't want to quit, maybe have 2 jobs and they don't have a lot of time. So yeah, the flexibility is a really big selling point here. The live cohort model is the third model. Now, this is a much newer one. This is something the Fountain Institute also works in. And the way these courses, they won't be selling you necessarily accessibility and flexibility, they'll be selling you community. That's going to be a big aspect of this because what they're doing is live classes. So everything is based off, the start date, the end date. You start at the same time, you end at the same time. So doing that along with a group of people means you get to kind of build a little bit more of a community feeling with them. So a lot of them are going to be talking about that. This cohort-based course, also becoming known as a CBC. One of the first big players in this space was Alt MBA, which was, I think, 2017, so it's all relatively new. Building a Second Brain and Rite of Passage are more famous ones. And Hyper Island is like a bit more of a traditional version who's doing something similar to it. But the kind of shining example of this is that you have a cohort that starts at the same time, ends at the same time, has lots of live interactions with the teacher and with each other. And that's how this works. And if that sounds familiar, that's because that's kind of how university works. You're just doing it online. So it's not necessarily anything new, but because of emerging tools like Zoom and Miro and things like that being available in Slack, it's quite easy to do this kind of real-time live class. Building a Second Brain has a really interesting way of talking about the platform. They'll say how many live sessions there are. They also include pre-recorded content, as you'll see there. And then they almost always give you a discussion forum or a Slack or something like that in real time to kind of supplement the materials that you learn online. So those are some examples really quickly of the 3 types of online courses that I see. Masterclass model, more on the one-way side of interaction, the hybrid model in the middle, and the live cohort model on the 2-way side. Now, what's interesting about these as well is while they have different UX because of their different types of interactions, they also have very different outcomes. The Masterclass model on the left side there, that gets around a 5% completion rate. So what is completion rate? When you're working at an online education company or an education company, you think about completion rate as like, okay, that's the metric that I'm watching. And if you don't, maybe you're looking at sales, but I think completion rate's a better one. I think there are more specific metrics, but completion rate is a really good health metric for if you're creating a good learning experience. If your completion rate is at 5%, like a lot of these MOOCs, masterclass models, then that means 95% of people who take your course do not finish it, which is pretty insane if you think about it. If you designed an app as a UX designer and 95% of your customers couldn't get through the customer journey that exists for your company, I think that you'd probably be fired on the spot. It's a pretty sad sign when 5% success rate is seen as okay in education. And this didn't come out until a few years ago because they don't release these metrics and these numbers. But this did come out about the MOOC masterclass model that's only 5% completion rate. Sometimes as low as 3, sometimes as high as 10. It does vary. There's a lot of different providers and growing. It's a growing thing. But if this isn't for you and you really want interaction and you're not the most disciplined student and you just maybe want to learn with other people and learn the community, then the Masterclass model, knowing that it's only 5% completion rate, might affect whether you choose that or not. Maybe you're the 5%. Maybe you can do it. It's totally up to the way you learn. And I think it's important to understand how you learn. The hybrid model there in the middle, kind of in between no interactions, one-way interactions, and the two-way interactions, these are really vary a lot, right? It's really difficult to nail down where they are on the one-way or the two-way interactions. But the hybrid models, depending on which school you look at, anywhere from 20% completion rate to 60% completion rate. Of course, there's going to be outliers, but kind of falls in the middle, which kind of isn't that surprising. But as they add more interactions, there's a higher completion rate, which is quite interesting, right? So the more interactions that the students have with the instructor and themselves and other people, like in the more like close to like a live class they have, the more people complete the course, which is a really interesting thing to realize. And of course, the live cohort model, on the more two-way, the more interactive one, that's going to see something like 75% completion rate, and even higher. Like we've been working with like a 95% completion rate. We're really trying to make that go up at the Fountain Institute. So I feel like understanding that, the behind the scenes, this is public information. You can find it online. I can send it to you if you're curious about it. But knowing that around 5%, somewhere between 40 and 60% and 75% and above is what you're dealing with through these three types of online courses, might be something you want to know when you're shopping for an online course. So I hope that's helpful. That's kind of how I think about online courses. This isn't something you'll necessarily find online, something I'm bringing today, the spectrum of interaction. So take that with a grain of salt. It comes from my own experience and some research in the field. So knowing that kind of crazy bit of information, that the completion rate is so low on some of these courses, I kind of have a different way of thinking about the UX of learning. You know what I was talking about, this quote that I said earlier, or kind of the summary of Don Norman was saying, UX design mindset, if technology isn't intuitive for the user, it's not designed well. Well, I take a more specific and different and kind of similar mindset when it comes to the UX of learning. If a learner can't complete a course, it's not designed well. Now, I posted about this pretty recently, trying to get some feedback and see what this sort of messaging kind of rings with other people. But I've kind of been thinking about like this for a while. And a lot of people would say, well, maybe you don't know. You don't know what's going on in their life. Maybe they had an emergency in their life. Maybe they had something come up they can't control. That's fine. But I'm as a UX designer working for an education company, if we're doing UX of learning, you have to assume that the learner is doing their best. I think that's the mindset you have to take. And if they can't complete it, it's not their fault. It's your fault as a designer. So it's a pretty intense thing to think. It feels about as radical as maybe saying that we should adapt technology to humans rather than the other way around, like in the 90s with Don Norman. But this is something that I think we can start moving forward with. As we move past this MOOC Masterclass model being the only option, I think that this UX of learning mindset will be helpful for other education providers. So I've talked with you a little behind the scenes working at an online education company and some of the things I've learned from research. But I want to talk to you now for something that anybody who learns can use. So these are some tips that I want to leave with you so I can talk about what it is exactly that you should be doing when you're learning online to set yourself up for success. And the first thing that I want to address is the illusion of knowing. In the psychology of learning, this is a really common thing to talk about. The illusion of knowing means that you think you learned what you wanted from that course, you got it. But that's not really how our brains work. A lot of times we think we know something, but we don't actually know it. And when you're taking courses that aren't doing a lot of interactions, it's quite easy to have the illusion of knowing. Maybe you've seen this meme going around. I kind of adapted this. This is how you think your brain works when you're reading your assignment for your class, and how your brain actually works when you're reading. You think that it's locked in and it's going to stick. It's there with you forever. You think, my brain's a steel trap. I can read this and I've got it. But it washes away. And if you don't do some things that I'm going to talk about here in a little bit, it will wash away faster. So I want to talk about some things you can do to avoid this. But looking at the illusion of knowing, this is going to help you understand how to avoid the illusion of knowing. There's the illusion of repetition. So what a lot of people will do, a lot of us probably did at university, is we'll like reread the text. So if I reread the text, I'll get it. That's kind of the mindset. This just doesn't work. There's psychology emerging proving this, that you just really don't do yourself much of a favor when you reread the text. It's much better to quiz yourself. It's much better to try and recall the information, because as you do that, you're strengthening the neural pathways. But when you're reading something, you're not doing the same amount of strengthening, and you're also quite easily going to get distracted when you read it the second time around. So be aware of using repetition. This can cause the illusion of knowing. You can't brute force repeat something to get it. The next one, the illusion of confidence. A lot of times we think we know more than we know. So this is a big one to watch out for. This can happen in a lot of different ways, but feedback is a really good way to avoid doing this. If you get feedback from someone, maybe that'll help you know that it's just the illusion of confidence. You don't actually know the ideas behind what it is you're learning. The illusion of simplicity. It might seem really simple when you're being taught something in a video, how to do it, but until you do it yourself, you're going to think it's just super simple. But when you do it yourself, you're going to realize it's quite difficult. So the illusion of simplicity is, well, you watch someone do something, or you hear someone explain how to do something, you think you can just do it immediately. But that's not the case. It's going to be difficult for you. Like you can probably read a really good novel, but writing a novel yourself is much harder. So there's a big gap between like understanding how something is and knowing when something's good, or appreciating something and actually doing it. So avoid the illusion of simplicity by doing project-based work, like trying to apply this, like try it out. Even before you know how to do it fully, even before you get the solution, try working through the problem. This will really help you. And the last one will be the illusion of ease. So you think that learning should be easy, because I said, of course, UX of learning mindset, if you can't finish, it's not your fault. But learning isn't going to be easy. Learning is going to be effortful. And if it's not effortful, then it's probably not working. You know that feeling when you're sitting there and you're trying to recall something, like it's on the tip of your tongue, you're trying to what is that word? When you're trying to do that, trying to recall that tip of the tongue phenomenon, that's how learning should kind of feel like when you're trying to make sure the learning sticks. You should be like, oh, what is that? And then when you find it, it strengthens the pathways. That's what I was talking about with repetition, like trying to recall can be super helpful. It will be effortful. I wouldn't say it's going to be, I don't like to use this word super difficult or anything like that, but it should be effortful, right? Much like exercising a muscle, it should be a little bit more effortful, but it does get easier. Just beware when it gets easier that you might not be learning as much as you were when it was more effortful. So those are some ways to avoid the illusion of knowing. And then I want to give you something now that I've used for a long time. This is a simple framework that I use to turn anything into a bit of a learning experience, because I really like reading. So how do I turn something like reading into a better learning experience? How do I turn an online course that's just a bunch of videos behind a paywall? How do I turn that into a better learning experience, and how do I make it stick? Well, this is something that I've used a lot. Learn, create, and share. So of course, the first step, maybe you read something, maybe you watch a talk like this. Then the next step is super important, create. As designers, we'll be used to doing this, but when you create, you put something in your own words, you reframe it, you reshift it, you summarize it, you put it in a new context. This really tests whether you get it or not. Because understanding something is much different. Like knowing the ideas behind something is much different than knowing it. And creating will kind of show that you know the ideas behind it, that you can apply the concepts in new areas, you can put it in new contexts. That's what creating does for you. And then of course, share. It's super important to put things out there. This is how you're going to get feedback. And of course, it's a really nice benefit that it closed the loop and someone else sees what you learned and they can go through the cycle again, and they can go on and on and on. So I think this is a really easy, quick way to think about how to learn well. This is kind of like project-based learning, simplified in sort of a design process. But yeah, this is something that I've used for a long time and kind of stumbled into it, realized when I read something and wrote a blog post about it and posted it and got some feedback on it that I really learned a lot more sticky. Like it stayed in my brain and I knew it better, and I could kind of talk about it intelligently and use it in interviews and things like that, use it on the job. So this can be helpful for you. And then finally, this might be a good time to take a screenshot. You can do that. Whoops, wrong way. Here you go, tips for studying online. These tips can help you when you're taking an online course and maybe it's not got the best UX. Doing some of these 7 things can make sure that you're setting yourself up for success. The first thing, take the course with a friend or accountability partner. They're going to push you and be like, hey, did you do that assignment? Are you showing up for class? Did you complete that course? That's super helpful. Having human motivation, we're very social creatures. We care about our own networks and our people, and we're altruistic. We want to help others. So that really helps you to have a friend. Makes it more fun, of course, but even an accountability partner can help. Make a calendar with milestones. So one of the problems with the self-paced and session-based, like Masterclass and hybrid models, the boot camps, is they're just going to give you an expiration date, or they're just going to go, there's no expiration date, do it whenever you want. But that's not really good for motivation. Doing some big picture planning and setting goals and milestones for yourself, like after the first week, I'm going to finish this, and really holding yourself to it. That's the hard part. But doing a little bit of prep like that can really set yourself up for success. This one I really love. Learn in a special place at a special time with low distractions. So for me, an example of this is I have this corner chair in my house. And when I wake up, I always start the coffee and I sit down and I do a Duolingo. And I sit there and do that in a place that I always do that. And I have my notebook next to me so I can take some notes about it and summarize things. And for me, that's a really great way to learn every single day. And when you get into that special place at that special time, your brain just kind of goes like, it's time to learn. So I think this is a really great way to take any sort of online course, because you're sitting on your computer, you might be sitting at your work, working on your desk, and then you're like, I've got to start my course. But it's really good to move to a different location, and of course, doing it at a different time. This includes time boxing. So at a special time means you should probably time box the work that you're doing. To-do lists aren't nearly as effective as time boxing. So try that out. I think it'll help you with motivation. Another one is, if they don't assign you a project or a homework assignment, assign it to yourself. Apply the learnings in a real world project as soon as possible. If you're a working designer, like many people in the Guild of Working Designers, it's really important to apply what you learn directly to a work project. That's the only real way, I think, to get better at design, is to do it in an actual project at work. Sure, you can do it in a hypothetical project. You can do a presentation like I'm doing. You can do a workshop for other people. But I think it's important to apply this to work, because that's connected to your salary and your livelihood. And it's a little bit more motivating. And I think you try it and push yourself to do a little higher quality when you think about your peers. Finally, number 5, ask for feedback from someone further in their journey. Well, that means if you can only find someone who's at the same level as you, someone in your class, that's great. Getting feedback is always really helpful. But if someone's already gone through that learning journey you're going through, or they've gone through several learning journeys in a more advanced way, then they're good people to give you feedback. I know this is not always possible, but I do recommend just asking people. Just say, hey, can you give me 15 minutes to look at this thing I'm working on? That'll give you so much help. Because getting feedback really helps you to avoid a lot of these illusions of knowing, and it helps to connect it to your memory, because when someone tells you what your work is, it's something you pay attention to. Present what you learn to a peer. I would recommend presenting what you learn to your colleagues. Maybe you do like a 15-minute lunch and learn, a brown bag kind of situation, and you say, hey, I'm going to present what I learned in this course for 15 minutes. Come join. Optional, don't worry about it. I've done this several times in my career, and I think it was really helpful for me. Not only is it forcing me to share what I've learned and apply it and zoom out and apply it to my company and my job, it's also just a really good way to be seen up on the stage talking about something that's interesting. Maybe you're talking about like a VR thing, and there's a VR project coming up, and someone goes, oh, they were just talking about this, and you get assigned to that project. So I think presenting to your peers at work, if you're doing a course related to work, is a really good idea. Finally, the last one, the best way to learn something is to teach someone else what you learned. And again, I love this one because it closes the cycle, because when you teach someone else something, they can start this learning journey on their own as well. But teaching something, much like presenting, just going a little bit further, it forces you to think about the kind of principles beneath something in the way you learn. So I think these are 7 ways you can really turn any sort of online course into a really good learning experience. Finally, my final call to you is I would like all of you to become a lifelong learner. On the left, what you see is university. You do a little bit of learning. Maybe you get a master's. So there's 2 little bumps in your education. On the right side, you see a lifelong fold of shorter cycles of learning. And we never know really what's going to happen in the design field. Things might change, things might get automated, new careers will most definitely pop up. And you need to stay agile to these types of changes in the design career field. So I really feel like becoming a lifelong learner, continuously going through cycles of learning, is the best way that you can stay future-proof. Thanks.